Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is an excellent crowd. My name is Jim Hill. I'm here from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about the officers of the Graf Zeppelin. The focus of our presentation will be the 8 officers of the Graf Zeppelin who ultimately served either as commanders or as first officers of the Graf Zeppelin, the Hindenburg, and the Graf Zeppelin II. We're going to take a look at the mail that they either originated or signed. We're going to learn how to identify their signatures. And we're going to hear some amazing Zeppelin stories that involve each of these great airship pioneers. So if you asked 1,000 people on the street today, who is Dr. Hugo Eckener? You'd get 1,000 blank stares, I'm confident. But in 1929, this gentleman, at the time of the round the world flight of the Graf Zeppelin, was regarded by many people as the most famous man in the world. How he became involved in the Zeppelin enterprise, his central role in the development of Zeppelin mail, is arguably, I think, one of the most improbable of all of our Zeppelin stories. Hugo Eckener was born in the town of Flensburg in northern Germany on the border of Denmark in 1868. And as a young man, he spent a lot of time on the Baltic Sea in sailboats, sailing around and learning how to forecast weather, which became an uncanny skill that he brought to his activities as a Zeppelin commander. In his early adulthood, he described himself as a philosopher, a political economist, and a person who occasionally dabbled in journalism. He wrote an occasional newspaper article. In 1905, when he was writing an article in the Frankfurter Zeitung newspaper, Eckener described the spectacular crash of one of the Pioneer Zeppelin airships. Among other things, the article discussed some of the limitations of the Zeppelins from his point of view. And he signed the article simply as Dr. E. Well, a few weeks later, Eckener had an unannounced visitor at his home in Constance, Germany, and the person knocking on the door was actually Count Zeppelin, who wanted to talk to him about his newspaper article. And after they spoke at length on that occasion and after a dinner meeting that followed that, Eckener agreed remarkably to serve as Count Zeppelin's publicist. He quickly fell under Count Zeppelin's spell. Within 2 years of becoming the publicist, he was a pilot of the Zeppelins. He followed that, becoming a trainer of captains during World War I. Right after World War I, he took over management of the Zeppelin company, piloted the first post-war LZ127 across the Atlantic Ocean in 1924. Around that time, he established a public charity fund to fund the construction of the Graf Zeppelin, flew that airship around the world in 1929, piloted dozens of flights after that, and ultimately became the head of the Zeppelin company. It seems to me that his accidental introduction to Graf Zeppelin and the meteoric rise that followed that were really among the most remarkable of Zeppelin stories. This card's part of another amazing Zeppelin story. In October of 1928, the Graf Zeppelin made its first flight to North America. And during the flight in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the airship encountered a very severe storm. And when it entered that storm front, the ship pitched sharply downward and then almost immediately sharply upward. And it was right around the time that breakfast was being served, and in the passenger area, the plates were all over the floor. In the galley, the pots and pans were flying all over the kitchen, and it was a remarkable event. And when the worst of the storm had passed, a work crew discovered that the rear stabilizer of the airship had been torn. It was covered by a fabric substance, and a work crew had to actually go down into the fin, inside the fin in the airship, and effect repairs. Among the people who went on that repair mission was Dr. Eckener's son, Knut. They were encountering during that repair a slipstream of in excess of 50 miles an hour, but they were able to successfully effect the repair, and the airship made its way safely to the United States. This card, which Dr. Eckener signed, was flown on the return flight of the Graf Zeppelin during that 1928 flight to the United States. A second Graf Zeppelin flight to North America was planned for 1929, and that flight resulted in yet another amazing Zeppelin story. As the Graf Zeppelin was proceeding south through France and down to Spain to enter the Mediterranean, its engines began to fail one by one. And this was of great concern to Dr. Eckener, who made the decision to actually turn the ship around and head back to Friedrichshafen, Germany, to his home base. And as it entered the road,
pilots, no?
Pardon me?
One of the pilots of the Zeppelin.
Yes, yes. And as the airship entered the Rhone River Valley in France, it encountered a wind called the Mistral, which was blowing against it. Because the airship had lost so many engines, it couldn't make
a lot of covers.
Couldn't make forward progress, and it had to put down at an emergency landing in Tours, France. The stabilizer was then subsequently repaired, and the airship returned to its base in Friedrichshafen. The American flight of 1929 was resumed in August of that year. This particular piece of mail was flown on that flight, and as we can see, it was. Go back, got the wrong device. It's signed down here by Dr. Eckener and also by his son Knut Eckener, who we mentioned previously had been on the repair crew on the 1928 flight. Dr. Eckener's dream was to have a regular Zeppelin service to carry mail back and forth between Germany and North and South America more quickly, more comfortably than ocean liners of the day. In order to demonstrate that potential, he arranged a triangular flight in 1930 from Germany to Brazil, on to North America, and then back to Germany. He and his colleagues foresaw, rather brilliantly it seems to me, how a sharing of postal fees for Zeppelin mail could serve as a source of funding for the Zeppelin's operating costs.
Was he German or American?
Yes, he was German. And so it was thus that the governments of Germany, Brazil, and the United States issued special stamps for what was dubbed the Graf Zeppelin Pan-American flight in 1930. Here we have a set of the 3 Zeppelin stamps, which were autographed by Dr. Eckener, and these are the only signed examples of these stamps that I have ever seen. I might add that the dealer who sold them to me has asked me repeatedly whether I would sell them back, and I have thus far declined. One of Doctor's finest, in my view, and most endearing attributes was his vocal criticism of the Nazi Party that took over Germany in the early part of 1933. And unlike many opponents of the regime, Eckener's worldwide fame really insulated him from the kinds of deadly consequences that often befell critics of the regime. In October of 1933, the Graf Zeppelin undertook a flight to the World's Fair in Chicago, Illinois. And prior to that, as the Nazis had taken over the government, the tricolor German flag, which had previously appeared on both of the tail fins of the Graf Zeppelin, had been replaced on one side by the swastika banner. And as Dr. Eckener approached the lakefront in Chicago, displaying the Zeppelin to the assembled crowds at the World Fair in 1933, he took particular care to fly the airship from west to east in order to avoid showing the crowd the Nazi banner that was on the other side of the airship. To me, this was one of his finest moments as an airship commander and as a German. Probably the next most famous of the Zeppelin commanders was Ernst Lehmann. Lehmann got his start as a Zeppelin pilot by serving as captain of the pioneer airship Sachsen, before serving as the captain of several German Army airships during World War I. After the war, he returned to the civilian Zeppelin company and was involved in the construction of the LZ127, which was later renamed the USS Los Angeles. That ship was built for the United States as part of Germany's war reparations obligation as a result of World War I. Lehmann frequently commanded flights of the Graf Zeppelin. This particular card from the 1930 Nordland flight to Hammerfest, Norway, was signed by Lehmann, Dr. Eckener, Umberto Nobile, the Italian airship pioneer, Knut Eckener, Captain Max Pruss, who we're going to meet in a minute, and Dr. Ludwig Duhr, who is the inventor of the duralumin alloy that was utilized in airship construction. So by March of 1936, when Captain Ernst Lehmann signed this greeting card from the Deutsche Zeppelin Reederei, the company that ran the Zeppelins at that point in time, Lehmann had become the director of flight operations for the company. Dr. Eckener's role had been reduced, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. A few days after the March 23rd date of this card, the Graf Zeppelin and the newly christened Hindenburg were scheduled to make a joint propaganda flight in order to drop leaflets supporting the annexation of the Rhineland to Germany. On the morning of the flight, Lehmann unwisely chose to bring the ship out in a very stiff wind, and the work party that brought the ship out of the shed was unable to control it, and the rear fin bounced along the ground and was pretty significantly damaged. And here's another amazing Zeppelin story that connects to that incident. Within earshot of reporters and others, Dr. Eckener told Lehmann, quote, "How could you, Herr Lehmann, order the ship to be brought out in such wind conditions? You had the best excuse in the world to postpone this idiotic flight. Instead, you risked the ship merely to avoid annoying Herr Goebbels. Do you call this showing a sense of responsibility to our enterprise?" Well, word of Dr. Eckener's statement quickly reached the propaganda ministry in Berlin, where Dr. Goebbels issued an order that Dr. Eckener was no longer to be photographed or seen in the newspapers, and that his name was no longer to be used. And this particular incident, I think, cemented Lehmann's status as the de facto leader of the Zeppelin enterprise and pretty much ensured that Dr. Eckener's role would be substantially reduced in the future. Here's a cover from the Hindenburg North American flight of 1936, on which both Ernst Lehmann and Dr. Eckener, now not the closest friends, affixed their signatures.
The photo was sent with the cover, or?
No, these photographs are separate from the covers. Just intended to show you who the people were. Unfortunately, Ernst Lehmann passed away in the Hindenburg disaster in May of 1937. This is a card that a German collector prepared a few days after the accident, memorializing Lehmann. This is Captain Hans von Schiller. Schiller joined the German Navy at the beginning of World War I and specifically volunteered for Zeppelin service. Like Lehmann, he piloted military Zeppelins throughout World War I and became involved in the peacetime Zeppelin company after the conflict was over. This autograph photo of Schiller was taken in 1924, which is around the time the LZ126 made its delivery flight to the United States. The adjacent card is from the Graf Zeppelin's 1930 Baltic Sea flight, and as we can see, it was autographed by Hans von Schiller. It was a little difficult to see the autograph on the photo, but that was likewise signed. Schiller piloted the Graf Zeppelin during many of its South American flights. This card, which he signed, traveled aboard the LZ127 during its fourth South American flight of 1932. That was the first year of regularly scheduled Zeppelin service between Germany and South America. This card, signed by Schiller, was posted aboard the Graf Zeppelin during its second South American flight of 1937. This was actually the last Zeppelin passenger flight that was to occur. This was actually 2 days after the Hindenburg disaster. That card was posted on board the Graf Zeppelin shortly before it landed for the last time, with passengers aboard at Friedrichshafen. Our last Hans von Schiller item is an interesting one. This is a birthday greeting, which he sent along with a number of other employees of the Zeppelin company to Captain Sammt, who we're going to meet in just a few minutes. And here we can see Schiller's typically very bold signature appearing there on the card. Hans Kurt Flemming was also a captain of the Graf Zeppelin. He was born in Stettin in North German state of Pomerania in 1886, and like Lehmann and Schiller, was involved both in the early civilian Zeppelins and in the World War I Zeppelins. He applied his distinctive signature, as we can see here, to this cover, which was flown aboard the Graf Zeppelin during the 1929 Orient flight to Jerusalem. And on the right, we have a separate picture of him also signed. Here we have Fleming's signature along with that of Lehmann on a Graf Zeppelin Baltic Sea flight cover from 1930, posted on board, as we can see from the onboard postmark. And this was actually among mail that was dropped from the airship over Helsinki, Finland during that flight. This is one of my favorite Zeppelin covers. It spans two very distinct eras. It was posted from the Swiss National Postage Stamp Exhibition in 1914, as we can see from the design on the envelope and the postmark, and then reposted on the fourth South American flight of the Graf Zeppelin in 1934. This particular piece is signed by Flemming, Lehmann, and Schiller. Our next captain that we're going to meet is Max Pruss. He was born in East Prussia in 1891, and as a German naval aviator, served as an elevator man on numerous World War I Zeppelins. He likewise served as the elevator man on the 1924 delivery flight of the LZ127 to the United States. This particular card, which was posted on board the Graf Zeppelin during its October 29 trip to Sofia, Bulgaria, was signed by Dr. Duer, who we mentioned previously, was the inventor of the duralumin alloy used in the airships, Dr. Eckener, Lehmann, and Knut Eckener. And then Max Pruss down here in the corner. And it's addressed to an Anton Wittemann, who we will soon learn is another officer of the Graf Zeppelin, and that's actually Wittemann's handwriting. He prepared that card and had all his colleagues sign it. Here we've got another card that Pruss signed. This was flown on the 1930 Nordland flight of the Graf Zeppelin, where a mail drop was made at Bergen, Norway. This came back on the return flight, was postmarked on board on the 18th of July. And this particular piece was signed by Dr. Brewer, Max Pruss, Dr. Eckener, our Italian airship friend Umberto Nobile, Knut Eckener. In 1935, the Graf Zeppelin made a number of flights across the ocean to South America. This is a card from the 12th South American flight, which was remarkably the 100th ocean crossing of the Graf Zeppelin. As noted in the description and the address, this is addressed to Hermann Seeger, the Sammt dealer in Württemberg, and it was signed by Pruss both on the front and on the back. Actually, one would think that this is a scarce item. There were a number of these that Pruss prepared and that were sent to Seeger, so one can find one of these if one looks around long enough. Our next Graf Zeppelin officer is Albert Sammt. He was born in 1889 in Württemberg. He got his start at the Zeppelin Works prior to World War I as a rigger and a rudderman on the LZ127, the Victoria Louise.
Why do you have Austrian stamps?
Because it was mailed from Austria.
Oh, okay.
During World War I, Sammt was primarily involved in airship construction for the Zeppelin Company. After the war, he became an elevator man on the first post-war Zeppelin, the LZ120 Bodensee. When the wartime airship sheds in Berlin were sold to a movie company, shortly after the end of World War I, Sammt took some time off from being a Zeppelin officer and worked for the movie company. He was actually involved in the production of the movie Metropolis by Fritz Lang. Something I never knew and learned as part of my preparation for this speech. He returned to the Zeppelin Company in 1924 to work on the LZ126 and served as elevator man on its 1924 delivery flight. He served on the Graf Zeppelin during most of its signature flights and was the key member of the work party that repaired the damaged fin. He actually went on the outside of the airship in 1928 when the fin was damaged in the storm and cut off the portion of the fabric that was following the control surfaces, and quite a heroic act by any measure. After the untimely death of Hans Flemming in 1935, Sammt was promoted to watch officer of the Graf Zeppelin, and here we have a card from the 1931 Egypt flight of the Graf Zeppelin, which he signed, which our gentleman friend here pointed out was posted from Vienna in Austria. That's not unusual. This is Zeppelin mail that was posted from other countries. A number of countries had treaties with the Zeppelin company and the Reichspost that allowed their mail to be transported on the Zeppelins, and that explains why the Austrian stamps are on there. This is a card from the Hindenburg's 9th North American flight of 1936, which was posted on board during the trip from Frankfurt, Germany to Lakehurst, New Jersey. As you can see from this postmark, Captain Sammt addressed this card to himself. This is his printing, which we come to recognize as we look at lots of pieces of Zeppelin mail. And this final Sammt item gives us an opportunity to talk a little bit about Zeppelin captain signatures or crew signatures and watching out for material that was actually signed after the Zeppelin enterprise was over with. This particular piece was signed after World War II, and the reason we know that is because it's signed in ballpoint pen. And ballpoint pens were not commercially available until after the end of World War II, beginning in about 1946. So some of the Zeppelin officers signed mail after the war was over, and it's usually distinguished by the fact that it was not signed by fountain pen, but rather by ballpoint pen. Our next airship captain is Anton Wittemann. This is a piece that he posted aboard the Graf Zeppelin's Egypt flight on the 10th of April, 1931. And this leads us into another amazing Zeppelin story, and that story involves the onboard post office aboard the Graf Zeppelin. Typically, the post office had stamps that were available for sale to passengers and crew members who wanted to post mail aboard the ship. On this particular occasion, one of the passengers posted a whole bunch of mail and exhausted the ship's supply of postage stamps. And so this particular piece was posted by Anton Wittemann aboard the ship. And here we have a legend that was written up in the upper right-hand corner, Affranchissement percu, 1 Reichsmark, and that is the international accepted legend for putting out a piece of mail when the postage has been paid, but not by an adhesive. And so the Zeppelin landed subsequently in Cairo, and some stamps got aboard somehow, whether they came from the German embassy. Later mail that was flown on that flight typically does have stamps. Here we have a card that was addressed to Selma Seeger, Herman Seeger's wife, stamp dealer in Württemberg, and this was flown on the German flight, the Deutschland flight to Berlin in 1934, and it is signed by Ernst Lehmann, Hans Flemming, Max Pruss, Albert Sammt, and Anton Wittemann, along with Willie Speck, who was the chief radio operator on the Graf Zeppelin. This is a card from Anton Wittemann's first flight in command of the Graf Zeppelin. It was flown aboard the Zeppelin on the 3rd South American flight of 1935. We can't see the back, but from the back I can tell you that the card was posted on board the airship during the return flight to Germany. And it's signed by Wittemann, in commemoration of his first trip in command of the Zeppelin, along with the radio operator Willie Speck. And the collector adhered a local newspaper article captioned Friedrichshafen, which discusses the fact that this was Captain Wittemann's first flight in command of the Graf Zeppelin. Our last airship officer is Heinrich Bauer. Bauer was a latecomer to the Zeppelin enterprise. I believe he joined the company in 1929 as a helmsman, and by 1936 he worked his way up to the position of watch officer, flying on board the Graf Zeppelin in Hindenburg. The watch officer was the third in command on the airship. And here we have a card that Bauer signed. This is from the 5th South American flight of 1932. His signature appears down here in the lower left corner in its typical form. He didn't sign with a flourish. He usually signed the signature very small on these items. And here we have Max Pruss, Ernst Lehmann, Bauer, and Dr. Ludwig Müller, who we discussed previously. Bauer was also aboard the Hindenburg during the 13th South American flight of 1936. He signed this photo or this cover as well. There's Max Pruss's signature and Heinrich Bauer. I would add that Bauer's signature is not common on Zeppelin mail. It's I think I have a couple of pieces in my collection with his signature. As our final Heinrich Bauer item, here we have a greeting card from 1938, New Year's 1938, which he sent to a family with whom he corresponded and to whom he sent a fair amount of Zeppelin mail over the years, the Spidell family. But here we have his signature in the lower right-hand corner. Our last item that I wanted to show today is a Chicago flight card, which contains 6 of the 7 post-war Zeppelin commanders' signatures. Here we have Dr. Eckener, Hans von Schiller, Max Pruss, Hans Flemming, Ernst Lehmann, Anton Wittemann. And it's also signed by Carl Boyerly, who was the chief engineer of the Graf Zeppelin, along with Knut Eckener and the radio operator, Willie Speck. And I would suggest to you that by any measure, this is one amazing piece of Zeppelin mail. And that concludes our presentation on the officers of the Graf Zeppelin. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
In Argentina had the first airmail set, and they overprinted it with Zeppelin in black and in green.
Yes.
And the one piece of print, 80 in green, was very scarce.
Mm-hmm.
I had a cover that went from Argentina via recipient to Germany, and I sent it to Cherrystone, and they told me they didn't have a market for that cover. I finally sold about place out, but very unique cover. Complete set in green, overprinted in green.
Well, it sounds like a great cover. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Were all these officers on board this flight?
You know, all of these were on board this flight. This was posted on board at the very beginning of the flight. And yes, they were all on board. Some of the items that you saw today were not all signed at the same time. And it's hard to distinguish when an item was posted on board and signed by everybody on board at the same time, or maybe had signatures that were acquired later on. But the presence of an onboard postmark and research as to who was on board the ship at that particular point in time can really pin that down.
Seems like with all of these captains, there might have been a problem with who was in command.
Well, but they were not all captains at the same time. Over the course of the life of the Graf Zeppelin from 1928 until 1937, the ship had a number of captains. The Hindenburg had a number of captains, each of whom was authorized to fly the airship as commanding officer. So on this particular flight, some of these other people were serving either as navigator, as watch officer, as first officer, and then there was a captain, or they were on board as observers, or whatever. Yeah.
How close is that George C. Scott movie to reality?
Well, you have to ask the Hindenburg expert here, but I think there were a few liberties that were taken with the historical facts in that movie. That would be my assessment, but
It's a good way to put it.
or maybe more than a few.
What was the name of the movie? I forgot.
Hindenburg, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think his portrayal of General Patton was a much more accurate representation. Yeah.
Do you know how many bombing flights did Captain Lehmann make over London in World War I?
I do not know, but I know that he did.
And do you know if they were considered successful?
Well, the damage on the ground would suggest that they were, but I'm not an expert on the World War I bombings of the Zeppelins, but it seems to me that rather than being a strategic bomber of the type that we used in World War II to destroy industrial targets, it was more of a terror weapon. And so whether it was successful or not, probably not. I mean, judging from the British reaction to the bombing in World War II, it didn't seem to curb their appetite to continue the war.